December 1941. Icy waves of the North Atlantic crash against the steel hull of U-552. Deep beneath the surface, in the cramped steel belly, 4 German officers stand shoulder to shoulder at the shimmering periscope. Only the creak of metal, the drone of diesels, and heavy breathing can be heard. Captain Eric Topp, a renowned ace, squints, intently peering into the eyepiece. "Target acquired," he reports hoarsely. In the scope, a silhouette. Huge, ponderous, clumsy. German engineers studying captured blueprints of this vessel type contemptuously called it the ugly duckling. "It's just an iron barge," one of them scoffed at a meeting in Kiel, looking at the primitive schematics. They laughed at its simple, almost crude design, at its welded seams, at its complete lack of aesthetics. "It's not a ship, it's a floating warehouse, hastily put together," echoed another. Topp didn't hear these taunts, but his eyes, accustomed to the elegant lines of military cruisers, also noted its clunkiness. This was something entirely different from the majestic transatlantic liners that had once plied these waters. A workhorse ship, devoid of all grace. But now it was just a target. A brief command, a dull sonar thud, the hiss of compressed air. A torpedo, like a predatory fish, breaks free from its moorings and plunges into the icy abyss. Long, agonizing seconds of waiting that feel like an eternity. Then a dull, shattering explosion. The water in the periscope boils, debris flies skyward. Another Allied convoy has lost another vessel. The crew of U-552 exchange brief glances, their faces showing a familiar mix of weariness and satisfaction. Another step towards victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. They didn't know they were seeing more than just a sinking merchant ship. They saw only a single grain of sand on an endless beach. They didn't know that this iron barge was the harbinger of their own end. They laughed. 2 years later, they weren't laughing anymore. March 1942. Winston Churchill's office in London. The air is thick with cigar smoke and tension. Maps are spread across the table, crisscrossed with red and blue lines, convoy routes, and the operational zones of Donitz's wolf packs. The figures were horrifying. The tonnage sent to the bottom of the Atlantic was growing exponentially. The British Empire was suffocating. Factories were shutting down. The population was starving. The Allies were losing the battle of supply. Hitler called submarines the most important weapon in the war, and he was right. Every sunken transport meant thousands of tons of steel, coal, food, ammunition that never reached the front. It meant the lives of soldiers who received no reinforcements and civilians deprived of basic necessities. While Nazi propaganda trumpeted the heroic deeds of the Grey Wolves and predicted Britain's imminent capitulation, across the ocean, in Washington, President Roosevelt well understood that defeat in the Atlantic would mean defeat in the entire war. But how to respond to this threat? How to compensate for losses that amounted to hundreds of thousands of tons per month? Building classic warships was time-consuming and expensive. A new approach, a radical solution, was needed. It was then that attention turned to a modest but ambitious project. The idea was not to build the perfect ship. The idea was to build enough ships, quickly, cheaply, and on a massive scale. This paradox, where quality yields to quantity and elegance to speed, would become the foundation of the American war economy. At first glance, it seemed like madness. How could one fight the most modern submarines in the world using vessels that looked like they were hastily cobbled together? The Allies, accustomed to high standards of shipbuilding, shook their heads skeptically. Even within the American Navy, voices of doubt were heard. "It's not a fleet, it's a factory," some said. "We're building ugly ducklings that are easy to sink," others echoed. But behind this seeming madness lay a brilliant strategy that changed the course of World War II. It was this scorn, this underestimation, this derision that would ultimately become Nazi Germany's most costly mistake. What seemed weak, what caused laughter, transformed into an inexorable weapon of unprecedented industrial might. And 2 years later, that weapon would silence the laughter forever. The story of the Liberty ship began long before its first iteration was launched. Its roots lay in the grim years of World War I, when German U-boats were already inflicting heavy damage on the British merchant fleet. At that time, Great Britain, facing a shortage of tonnage, ordered a number of standardized cargo ships from the USA. One such design was the EC2 SC1, a simple but reliable freighter known as the Type C. It was designed by a group of engineers led by John H. Andrews. These vessels were primitive, but they could be built quickly. When World War II began and the situation with the merchant fleet again became critical, the British government remembered the EC2 project. In 1940, facing catastrophic losses from German wolf packs, Churchill appealed to U.S. President Roosevelt. Britain needed ships, many ships, and immediately. Roosevelt, understanding the strategic importance of such aid, gave his approval. However, American engineers decided to refine the old design. Their goal was not to create a masterpiece of shipbuilding, but to create the simplest, most functional, and, most importantly, fastest-to-build vessel possible. Work on the modified version, named the Emergency Cargo Ship, began in full force. At the helm of the project was American engineer Henry J. Kaiser, known for his ambitious and revolutionary approaches to mass production. He was known as the Miracle Builder. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder by profession, but he was a genius of production organization. His experience in building dams and highways suggested to him that assembly line methods could also be applied to shipbuilding. The design of the Liberty ship was the embodiment of a compromise between cost, speed, and functionality. It was a vessel with a deadweight tonnage of about 10,500 tons, approximately 135 meters, 400 feet long. It had 5 cargo holds, and its maximum speed was only 11 knots, about 20 kilometers per hour. For comparison, many contemporary cargo ships of that era reached speeds of 15 to 18 knots. The main engine was a 3-cylinder steam engine, using coal as fuel. This was outdated technology, but it was simple to produce and maintain. More modern turbine engines were in short supply and reserved for warships. The first prototypes caused bewilderment. The lack of any aesthetics, the angular shapes, the visible welded seams, all went against traditional notions of shipbuilding. One British journalist called it the ugly duckling, and the nickname stuck. The American Navy, accustomed to high-tech destroyers and battleships, looked at these workhorses with unconcealed skepticism. The technical specifications were also unimpressive. Their slow speed made them an easy target for submarines, and the welded seams, intended to speed up assembly, initially caused concern. In the cold waters of the Atlantic, some of the first Liberty ships encountered a problem of steel brittleness, leading to cracks in the hull and even the breaking apart of vessels. Several such incidents were recorded, which only heightened the skepticism. These failures were thoroughly investigated, and changes were made to the design to improve strength. German intelligence, upon receiving data on the project, merely scoffed. They saw it as Allied desperation, evidence of their weakness. "The Americans are building disposable tin cans," joked the Kriegsmarine staff. They were confident they could sink these ugly ducklings faster than they could be built. For the Germans, it was a sign of the American fleet's low combat effectiveness, its inability to compete with the Reich's high-tech submarines. German engineers believed that such a primitive vessel posed no serious threat, merely confirming their superiority in shipbuilding and military technology. They were convinced that the mass production of such misunderstandings was just a futile attempt by a drowning man to grasp at a straw. Everything looked like a failure, like a temporary, desperate solution doomed to fail. The audience was meant to believe in this failure, to believe that this cumbersome, slow, ugly duckling could not change the course of the war. But it was precisely in this underestimation that the enemy's main blunder lay. While the Germans laughed, American engineers, workers, and organizers prepared to show the world the true power of their industry. They were ready to launch an assembly line that would change the world. America awoke. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor changed her forever. A country that had lived a measured life suddenly found itself drawn into the vortex of global war. And the response was immediate, deafening. If factories had previously operated at half capacity, now they hummed around the clock, non-stop, like a single giant mechanism. This was not just an increase in production, it was an industrial revolution in real time. Henry J. Kaiser, the man behind the Liberty ship, was exactly the person who could bring about this metamorphosis. He wasn't a traditional shipbuilder, and that was his advantage. He came to shipbuilding with mass production principles he'd honed in the automotive and construction industries. Before him, building a ship was a long, painstaking process, akin to creating a work of art. A ship was built from keel to mast on a single slipway, taking months, even years. Kaiser, however, proposed a radically different scheme: segmented construction. The entire ship, from bow to stern, was broken down into hundreds and then thousands of standardized sections. These sections, hull blocks, decks, superstructures, engine rooms, were manufactured simultaneously, in parallel, in different factories and workshops across the country. Tens of thousands of enterprises, from tiny workshops to massive steel mills, were integrated into a single production chain. Parts, like a giant construction set, were brought to the shipyards where they were assembled, just like car parts on an assembly line. Cranes, humming like an army of giants, lifted huge blocks weighing up to 100 tons and precisely lowered them into place. The numbers were shocking. Before the war, building an average cargo ship took about a year. Kaiser promised to cut that time to a few weeks, and he delivered. In 1941, the Kaiser Richmond shipyard in California, one of the flagships of this production machine, launched the first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, in 244 days. Impressive? Not enough. Kaiser wanted more. He introduced 24/7 operations in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. He hired everyone: men, women, students, retirees. Former farmers, office workers, housewives toiled in the shipyards. They were trained in welding in a matter of days. In August 1942, the world witnessed a miracle. The keel of the Robert Peary was laid at the Kaiser Richmond shipyard. The whole world watched. In just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, this vessel, displacing over 10,000 tons, was launched. This was not an isolated incident. It was a symbol of a new era. The pace of production increased every month. If 16 Liberty ships were built in January 1942, by the end of the year, their number exceeded 100 per month. By 1943, American shipyards were launching up to 3 Liberty ships a day, every single day. This was the industrial rhythm that America now lived by. This colossal productivity was achieved not only through brilliant organization. American engineers perfected standardization and interchangeability of parts. Screws, bolts, valves, pipes, everything was unified. If one factory lacked a certain part, it could be ordered from dozens of others. This ensured uninterrupted supplies and prevented downtime. Ship repairs in ports also became record fast, as replacing a damaged component did not require individual fitting. Liberty ships were workhorses that carried everything necessary for waging war. They transported tanks, trucks, airplanes, disassembled and packed in crates, millions of tons of food, ammunition, coal, and oil. One Liberty ship could carry 2,840 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of ammunition.
Imagine almost 5,000 tanks transported by just 20 ships, or an entire Army Corps delivered across the ocean. The logistical network created to support this flow was no less grand. Railroads and trucks continuously delivered raw materials and components to factories and finished sections to shipyards. From the shipyards, in turn, fully loaded convoys set off across the globe, to Great Britain, to the Soviet Union, to North Africa, to the Pacific Front. This was not just a factory. This was a factory that fed the war, a factory that never slept. Its assembly line hummed, its cranes groaned, its arc welders sparked, creating an inexorable flood of steel that was destined to crush the enemy. It took the Germans 6,000 man-hours to build one tank, but the Americans produced 12 a day from a single factory. With Liberty ships, the count wasn't in weeks, but in days. This was a new, frightening rhythm for the enemy. By early 1943, a grim mood prevailed at the Kriegsmarine headquarters. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the submarine fleet and one of the most experienced naval strategists of the war, could not believe what he was being told. Before him lay graphs, figures, intelligence reports that seemed utterly absurd.
The tonnage of Allied ships sunk by German U-boats, though still high, was no longer growing as rapidly as in previous years. Worse yet, the volume of cargo being delivered to the Allies was not only not decreasing, but on the contrary, was increasing. Donitz, accustomed to precision and order, was confronted with something irrational. His wolf packs, consisting of hundreds of submarines, operated with maximum efficiency. As early as 1942, they were sinking up to 1 million tons a month. But America, it seemed, was building ships faster than Germany could sink them. Every sunken Liberty ship was immediately replaced by 2, then 3 new ones. In his memoirs, Donitz would later write, "Allied losses were heavy, but they could replace them." By mid-1943, it became clear that the Battle of the Atlantic, as we were fighting it, was lost. The Americans simply produced ships faster than we could sink them. This was not just an admission of defeat, it was a shock. They were fighting not a fleet, but a factory. The real testimonies of German submariners who encountered this abundance sound almost surreal. Encountering a convoy of 50 to 70 ships was common. But then the convoys began to grow. 80, 100, 120 ships. In 1943, some convoys numbered up to 150 to 200 vessels. German submariner Oberleutnant zur See Herbert Werner, serving on U-415, in his memoirs Iron Coffins, describes an instance where his boat, having expended all its torpedoes and sunk several ships, returned to base expecting praise, only to find that the Allies had delivered more cargo to shore than had been sunk. This was psychologically devastating. "We sank them, and they just reappeared, like mushrooms after rain," Werner wrote. German crews, until then convinced of their invincibility, began to have doubts. Missions became increasingly dangerous, the chances of success diminished, and returning to base became a game of roulette. At the same time, the Allies were not only building ships, but also equipping them much better, improving escort. Each Liberty ship was armed with several anti-aircraft guns, and escort aircraft carriers began appearing in convoys, depriving the submariners of their main trump card, surprise. Imagine the contrast. While a German crew, exhausted from a multi-day patrol, shared the last jerry can of fuel and meager rations, American sailors aboard Liberty ships could afford to drain gasoline from overflowing tanks on deck because its smell interfered with their sleep. This is not an anecdote, but a real incident described by veterans. Abundance bordering on waste versus desperate economizing. This was not a war against an army, it was a war against an economy, German officers reported upon returning from missions. They saw endless rows of trucks, endless trains, endless convoys, and each of them, every tank,
Every truck, every crate of provisions was delivered across the ocean by those very ugly ducklings they had once laughed at. Third Reich propaganda tried to conceal the true state of affairs, claiming thousands of ships sunk and an imminent collapse of Allied logistics. But the reality on the fronts spoke for itself. Resource shortages in Germany became increasingly acute, while the Allies constantly increased their presence in all corners of the world. In North Africa, Rommel's troops retreated not only under the pressure of British and American soldiers, but also under the weight of their superior supplies.
Every British or American soldier had many times more ammunition, fuel, and provisions than his German counterpart. In December 1943, a secret report destined for Hitler contained grim conclusions. Further unrestricted submarine warfare under the current buildup of enemy shipbuilding will not achieve the desired result. This sentence, dry and unemotional, was a verdict. The Germans encountered a phenomenon they could not comprehend, an industry operating on an entirely different scale. A blow, a pause, the next blow. Each sunken ship, a blow. Each new convoy, a pause for reflection. Each newly built Liberty ship, the next blow, delivered by America, tirelessly, without slowing down. Shock and disbelief escalated into an awareness of the inevitability of defeat. By early 1944, the agony of the Battle of the Atlantic, as Germany understood it, was practically over. German submarines, once fearsome predators, had become hunted prey. Allied escorts, equipped with the latest radar, sonar, and naval aviation, systematically tracked and destroyed U-boats. But the main reason for this turnaround was not so much improved tactics or technology for combating submarines, but the very fact that sinking ships had become pointless. German Admiral Dönitz, realizing the futility of his efforts, officially admitted in April 1943 that the Atlantic battle had reached its climax, and that, under the current superiority of the enemy in the air and in escort ships, we cannot inflict decisive damage. It was a bitter but frank admission. He wasn't saying his submariners had become worse. He was saying their effectiveness was negated by the overwhelming industrial might of the enemy. During the war, American shipbuilding industry built over 5,000 large merchant ships, of which 2,710 were Liberty ships. The total tonnage delivered by these ugly ducklings amounted to hundreds of millions of tons. They ensured the D-Day landings, supplied Soviet troops via Lend-Lease, and supported campaigns in North Africa and the Pacific. Without them, as many historians acknowledge, the war might have ended very differently. This was not just a clash of armies. It was a clash of civilizations where one, militarized, relying on surprise and superiority in individual technologies, collided with another whose main strength was the ability to adapt, mass-produce, and virtually limitless resources. Germany, with its brilliant engineers and outstanding examples of military equipment, could not keep pace with America's industrial rhythm. One high-ranking German official, Alfred Rosenberg, bitterly noted in one of his letters to Hitler, "We are not fighting an army, we are fighting a factory." This factory, humming on the other side of the world, proved far more formidable than any tank or airplane. The final metaphor of the war found its embodiment not in heroic battles, but in the silent yet relentless flow of cargo across the ocean. These ships were not killing machines in the literal sense. They were machines for life, for sustaining the war, for supplying the front, for fueling Allied economies. And it was precisely in this that their true devastating impact lay. The Liberty ship was not just a ship. It was a stamped verdict, a verdict delivered on the assembly line. Each of the 2,710 ugly ducklings was a brick in the wall that America was building around the Third Reich, a wall of steel, fuel, food, and weapons. The war demonstrated that even the most advanced military technologies are useless without the ability to mass produce and deliver them. German Tigers were formidable tanks, but there were too few of them, and they were too difficult to repair. German submarines were effective, but they were being sunk faster than they were built, and the ships they did manage to sink were immediately replaced by new ones. This machine didn't just move, it rolled forward according to the laws of statistics, logistics, and steel, and it crushed its opponents. Thus ended the story of the Liberty ships, from an object of ridicule to a symbol of overwhelming industrial power. They didn't win a single battle in the traditional sense, but without them, no battle would have been won. They weren't beautiful, they weren't fast, but they were countless. And it was their sheer number, their relentless appearance, their endless flow, that ultimately broke the enemy's will and changed the course of World War II, showing the world the true strength of America.